and welcome today to this 2024 Gairdner Global Perspectives Panel. I am Sarah Devonshire, the Director of Awards at the Gairdner Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. In recent months, we've hosted a series of global perspective panels led by our early career investigator competition winners from recent years. Together, with presentations from world-leading researchers, they've shared the latest developments in precision cancer care and omics, prospects for mRNA therapeutics, and now the microbiome, from the microscopic to global. We're also excited to be launching the program for Gairdner Science Week 2024, running from October 21st to 25th, with 3 major symposia. We invite you to visit gairdner.org to see what we have planned and to join in the thrill of discovery. We hope you'll enjoy today's discussion and visit gairdner.org to sign up for upcoming events. And we'd like to thank our presenting sponsor for these sessions, TELUS Health. We'll now hand over proceedings to our Gairdner ECIs, Sarah Elton, Artem Babaian, and Abiola Olaitan.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Gairdner Global Discussion panel. My name is Artem Babaian. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in molecular genetics, and I'm joined today by the other ECI Gairdner recognized individuals, Abiola, Olton, and Sarah Elton. And today we get to share with you what I think is probably one of the most interesting and exciting areas of scientific research that's being done. And this is in the area of the microbiome. So the microbiome has been often discussed, and today we've brought 3 world-leading experts on the microbiome and at all scales to take us through a discussion and help figure out what is the microbiome and how does it influence your life. So I'd like to start with kind of a very broad overview question. So what is a microbiome? Well, like many things in biology that are worth discussing, there is no good definition of the microbiome. But you can, in general, summarize it as there's kind of a spectrum of definitions, the original one being a microbiome, which really came out of the school of ecology. And this is that the microbiome is a community of microbes which share a given environment, and it includes that environment and all of the abiotic factors. So it's this kind of mixture of biotic and abiotic influences. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have the kind of microbiome, right? Or it's also called kind of metagenomics. And this definition, what the microbiome is it's the total collection of nucleic acids or genetic information, often DNA, which make up a particular environment. Right, so this can include all the kind of accessory genes and functional genes. And added to this definition are things like metabolites and different type of molecules that exist in that environment and their interaction between between them. And so this definition is really coming from the kind of molecular school of biology, really being driven by technological advances in sequencing technology. So that's still quite an abstract definition. So I think I'd like to walk you through kind of a simple toy case of what is a microbiome. So I'd like you to think about your fingertip. So there's the kind of obvious things, the microorganisms that would exist on our fingertip, like the bacteria on the skin and maybe little bits of soil that we've touched. But then there's some things that we'll often not consider. So like things like worms, fungi, protists, plant pollen that can integrate in there. So this is a trichinella worm, and that forms a cyst inside the muscle of the finger. And so that trichinella worm, if you look inside its gut, there's actually bacteria in the gut of the worm that helps it digest its meal, be it you. And so in that case, all of those microbes are also part of our microbiome because we're looking at the entire collection of things. And then those bacteria and archaea, so those are the kind of classical microbes, they themselves can be infected by viruses and bacteriophages, which are essentially bacteria infecting viruses. And then that also is part of our kind of holistic microbiome. And you can even go one step deeper and say, well, those viruses can be infected by parasitic DNA, things like transposons, and just DNA, mobile genetic elements that transmit between different organisms. And so really the microbiome is not really about studying any one of these things in isolation. That's kind of classical microbiology. The microbiome is about studying all of these things that make up the sum of their parts, the synergy between all of these elements. So you can imagine that there's a transposon that integrates into the genome of a DNA bacteriophage, disrupts it, causes those phages to go lytic, that drives the extinction of a gut microbiome, that makes the worm go starved and escape its cyst, which goes into the blood vessel and results in a stroke in the individual, right? So it's understanding both the mutualistic, the parasitic, and the commensal relationships between all of these organisms and how they make a whole ecosystem that really captures the spirit of the microbiome. But you can also take a different perspective where that is just one microbiome in isolation. Really, we should also consider the entire spectrum that we all have our own hands, and there's differences between the microbiomes of me and you, and there's differences in the microbiome between the old and the young, and the healthy and the sick. And then you can further expand that definition and say, well, there's actually microbiomes in all species, not just humans. And all of those species interact with each other to some extent. So we have our pets and the microbiome of our pets and how that influences us. Or the microbiome of things like livestock, right? Like that trichinella worm may have come from a pig that we had eaten because that was part of that pig's microbiome. And then you can also then expand that to not just the other living species, but things like soil and the bacteria there, the water that we live in, the shared built environments that we have. And then not only is this a one-way street where these microbiomes are influencing us as humans, we are also influencing the environments around us. So things like pollutants and heavy metal contamination of soils will influence the community of microbes that live in that soil. And so understanding the microbiome really is about understanding complex systems. It's about the interaction between all of these elements and how they come together in this kind of global perspective of life on Earth. And so I view really the frontier of microbiome research as not just studying things in isolation, which is kind of the schooling of classic microbiology, but looking at integrated and complex systems and the interactions between them. And so I think that now with technological advances, this is going to be the most exciting time ever to be able to study these types of interactions and understand how life on Earth is greater than the sum of our individual parts. And so join me in a wonderful panel discussion about what is the microbiome, and hopefully we'll go on this journey together from the planetary to the microbial scale. So thank you, and I will pass it over to my co-host, Abiola Oltman, to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Artem, for that. So my name is Abiola Olaitan. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo, and it's a great honor for me to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Brett Finlay. A brief introduction about Dr. Brett Finlay. Dr. Brett Finlay is a professor at the Michael Smith Laboratories and the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, as well as Microbiology and Immunology at the University of British Columbia. He earned both his bachelor's and PhD degrees in biochemistry from the University of Alberta, followed by postdoctoral studies at the Stanford University School of Medicine, where he researched salmonella invasion into host cells. In 1989, he joined University of British Columbia as an assistant professor. Dr. Finlay's research focuses on host microbe interactions at the molecular level. By integrating cell biology and microbiology, he has become a leading figure in the field of cellular microbiology, making numerous groundbreaking discoveries in this area. His lab studies several pathogenic bacteria, including Salmonella and pathogenic E. coli, and more recently, microbiota. He has published over 575 papers. Dr. Finlay has received numerous prestigious awards, including 5 Howard Hughes International Research Scholar Awards, the CIHR Distinguished Investigator Award, the Canadian Killam Health Sciences Prize, the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal, and the Flavel Medal of the Royal Society, among many others. He's also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, and is also a member of German National Academy of Sciences, the European Academy of Sciences, and the American Academy of Microbiology. Dr. Finlay has also been inducted into the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame. Beyond his academic achievements, he co-founded several companies and initiatives focused on microbiome research, and is also the co-author of the best-selling books, Let Them Eat Death and The Whole Body Microbiome. We are honored to have Dr. Finlay with us this afternoon to share his thoughts into the role of the microbiome in human health and diseases. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brett Finlay.
Thank you for that introduction. So in 5 minutes, I have to distill everything I know about human health and microbiome, and give me about 10 years and I might be able to do it. So as been said, it's a really exciting area. And let's kick off by the fact that you are more microbial than you are human. There's at least as many microbes living in and on you as are human cells, and they encode at least 100 times as much genetic material. So I love to tell my students they're more microbial than human. So what we've realized in the last decade or so is the microbiome plays a profound influence on human health and disease. So where do you get your microbiome? Well, it's that very first birthday present you get from your mother, a big bolus of fecal and vaginal microbes when you're born. That actually is the first inoculation of the microbes into the human body, and that is going to kickstart you. And ironically, that's a very important event, and it allows you to basically a whole bunch of things. We know the microbiome is really important in your immune system developing, in your gut developing, and even brain development. Now we realize this plays a big role in it. So for those of you that have interfaced with kids, you'll know that there's a massive change in the physiology of the baby when you go from breastfed to solid foods. You see this in the diaper. That's when the microbiome switches from a milk-fed to a solid food one, and you know what happens in the diaper. So then basically you then start moving around the world as you put everything in your mouth as a baby, et cetera. That's where you're acquiring your microbes. And then you hit adolescence, and really your microbiome is pretty constant over most of your life. And then it depends on where you're living, who you interact with, what you eat type thing. And then we think that later in life, your microbiome falls off a cliff, and that has a big impact on aging. I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. So where are these microbes? They're all over your body. They're basically anywhere your body touches the outside world. So we heard about the skin, the armpits, for example. Microbes like moisture, like any life form. So they're in the groin and the armpits, for example. There's vaginal microbiomes, there's oral microbiomes, there's skin microbiomes. And of course, there's the gut microbiome, which is basically going down from the mouth to the anus. And as you go down that tube, which is technically outside your body, it's just a tube going through your body, the microbes increase in number. And when you get down to the lower bowel, that's where they're the most microbes. And to give you a number, to give you the size of the scale we're involved, 1 gram of feces, so a piece of feces the size of the tip of your little finger, there's more microbes in there than there are humans on this entire planet. So there's lots and lots of microbes in and on us. So, what are they good for? Well, we'll talk about that in a second. But really, here's a curve that I think just really, it exemplifies human history in the last 50 years or so. So Anthony van Leeuwenhoek discovered microbes when he invented the microscope, and then Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur showed in the 1800s they caused disease, and Louis Pasteur showed if you killed them via pasteurization, you block disease. So we went on a 125-year campaign to get rid of microbes. And we did this because we wanted to decrease infectious diseases. So you can see the left-hand part of this curve is infectious diseases plummeted. We no longer see the diseases we saw, say, 100 years ago. But what's really puzzling is the right-hand part of the curve. This is all the disease we see in society now. And really, we think that's because we've basically gotten rid of many of the microbes that are associated with. Antibiotics came along, hand sanitizer came along, hygiene came along, sewers, etc. came along. And ironically, in our quest to get rid of the bad microbes, we think we've also impacted the good ones. This is what we call the hygiene hypothesis. So in terms of health and disease, this is about a decade ago, we started to realize that people with different diseases that we never had a clue were microbiological had different microbiomes than the normal people that didn't have that disease. You can see a list of diseases going down through here, for example, that was some of the diseases that are being associated with the microbiome. Now, this just means they're changed in people with the disease. Doesn't mean they're causing the disease. But to give you an example of what we now know, if you take the list of the top 10 people, top 10 diseases that people die of in Canada, of those, there's only one obviously microbial, that's pneumonia, that's number 8. But of those other diseases, only one now does not have microbial connection, that's accidents. Even microbes are thought to cause depression, for example, so they might be involved in accidents. So basically, we now know that things like cardiovascular disease, microbes play a big role in that. And obesity, diabetes, Alzheimer's, etc. And the two diseases I've been heavily involved in are basically the bookends of life. One is early life microbes and the asthma. We've shown that there are key microbes that are involved in basically preventing you to get asthma. And if you lack these microbes, if you're born by C-section, for example, you have a much higher chance of getting asthma. And then the other end of the scale is Parkinson's, which you think is a brain disease, right? Well, it turns out Parkinson's starts about 30 years before in your gut. Big risk factors of Parkinson's are basically eating red meat, and that basically seems to screw up your gut. And also constipation is a major factor. And what we think is Parkinson's actually starts in the gut, and then it works its way up through the nerve that goes up to the brain, the vagus nerve, and there it triggers the neurological diseases. And we've shown that just by changing your diet to something called a MIND diet, which is like Mediterranean diet, you can slow the progressions of Parkinson's starting by over 17 years in women and a decade in men, just by changing what you eat, which basically changes the microbes. And given that this doesn't happen until at least 65, this is a profound event. So what we're now realizing, we're basically rewriting the whole textbook on medical diseases and health, and realizing these microbes play a major part in this. So I'm sure my 5 minutes are up by now, but anyway, they're important in us. They're your friends. They're also your enemies, and you have to figure out how to live with them. And by living with the good ones, you can then make it work in your favor. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Finlay. I look forward to hearing more from you in the panel discussion. It's now my great pleasure to introduce one of the leaders of Canada's virology community, Dr. Samira Mubareka. Dr. Mubareka grew up in a rural village just outside of, just in northwestern New Brunswick, where she became immersed into the natural world in this small village. This passion for the natural world is still evident in her research today. She spends her summers collecting samples from an assortment of Canadian wildlife to study their microbes and their microbiome and how that could influence us. Today, Dr. Mubareka is an infectious diseases physician at Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto and an associate professor in the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathobiology. There, she co-founded the Sunnybrook Translational Research Group for Emerging and Respiratory Viruses. Notably, at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Dr. Mubareka stepped up to the front lines of the pandemic response for Canada and served on the Chief Science Advisory of Canada's COVID-19 Expert Panel, the Ontario COVID-19 Science Table advising the government, and today chairs the Royal Society of Canada's One Health Working Group, which is the study of all microbiomes and how they interact with each other. Her research focuses on pathogen emergence at the human-animal interfaces for viruses like SARS-CoV-2 and influenza. She recently led the team that discovered one of the largest stable non-human reservoirs of SARS-CoV-2, which resides in Ontario white-tailed deer and poses a threat of spillback in the future. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mubareka.
Thank you very much, Artem. So it's a real pleasure to be joining you while it's evening here in Cape Town, and coincidentally, I'm joining you from the World One Health Congress that's happening here for the first time on the African continent. And you'll see how we'll be able to draw some of the common themes that are related between One Health and microbiomes. I really want to thank the Gairdner Foundation and organization for putting this together and for being able to join this illustrious panel. This really is, as Artem said at the top, a frontier in terms of biological research and knowledge. So it's important that we explore it, and it's important we explore it from a number of different perspectives. So that's really the opportunity I'll take this afternoon, is to talk about the links between the microbiomes, not only at the cellular level, the host level, but also at the population and ecosystem level. So I'm going to use avian influenza virus as a theme, or as a potential exemplar that will be able to illustrate some of the key points that I would like to make. What I'm going to do is I will narrow a little bit from what Dr. Finlay has already laid out in terms of the microbiome by focusing on viruses and viromes, and even a little bit more specifically about different viruses that reside within certain animal species. And in this case, we'll really be talking about avian species and avian influenza viruses. So to do this, I wanted to broaden, even though I'm narrowing in terms of from a microbial perspective, I wanted to broaden from a species perspective, because we know that the health of animals is really critical to our health, and the reverse is true. As Artem pointed out, we actually pushed a lot of viruses into animal species, for example, SARS coronavirus 2 during the pandemic, which obviously had some major implications across a number of different populations. What's happened with avian influenza virus has really been somewhat under-recognized, partly because there is an ongoing panzootic. So a panzootic is the animal equivalent of a pandemic. And this has been going on over the course of the last 2+ years. And interestingly, in terms of what's happened in North America, the first incursion of the virus happened in Newfoundland. This was some years ago, with more recent incursions, and you'll see these on the slide in front of you, of reassortant viruses. So part of the reason that this reassortment is happening is because the host species, the reservoir species for avian influenza viruses, are migratory waterfowl. Obviously, as the description entails migration, these animals, these hosts, are very much on the move, and they move with their viruses. And highly pathogenic avian influenza viruses reside within their hosts, not in isolation, but with other avian influenza viruses. And within cells, they will exchange segments and generate what we call new reassortants. So these reassortants also move globally across the world. So this is just one example. We went from H5N1 reassortants to H5N5 reassortants that have emerged in a couple of, luckily, very limited places in Canada. But we've also seen spillover of those particular viruses into mammals. So this is quite unusual and quite unprecedented. Really, what we're seeing are not only spillovers into these mammals, but also new manifestations. So mainly acute encephalitis and fairly severe disease. And there's no question that many of you heard the dairy cattle story and what's been happening with dairy cattle. So this is an excellent example of how you have to follow the virus. And if you do, it will take you to very interesting places and reveal some very interesting interactions between hosts, their cells, and populations. So very quickly, there's a highly pathogenic avian influenza virus called B3.13 that reassorted originally in migratory waterfowl, circulated in other wild birds, and spilled over into wild mammals, then eventually made its way into dairy cows, where it spilled over into other mammals, such as cats and mice, and then spread through different herds. And this is where ecosystems and how we use land and how we also raise our food comes into play. Because of what happened in the US, we now know that this virus has spread amongst many, many different dairy herds across several different states, number one, and it has also spilled over into a number of humans. So this is really the last point I'll come to. It's so important. This example really underscores a principle called the dynamics of proximity. So that's a concept that Raina Plowright and others have introduced. By moving hosts around, bringing them into proximity, allowing adaptation and spillover, we then amplify these effects and allow more adaptation and spillover to other species. And part of this is because of the way that we use land, the way that we disrupt what we would call, and again, Dr. Plowright coined this term, landscape immunity. So intact ecosystems are less likely to have emerging zoonoses because of certain factors. And if we have the opportunity, we can talk about these in the next hour or so, that really preserve immunity at the ecosystem level and not just at the cellular level. So I'll stop at that point and hand back over to the chairs with many thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Mubareka. We will now go to our third panelist, Dr. Benezra. Dr. Benezra is a sociocultural anthropologist who researches how studies of the human microbiome intersect with biomedical ethics, public health, and technological infrastructures and care. In partnership with human microbial ecologists, Dr. Benezra is developing an anthropology of microbes, and this is to address global health problems across disciplines. Dr. Benezra's book was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2023. It's titled Gut Anthro, An Experiment in Thinking with Microbes. And this is the first ethnography of the microbiome. It's based on fieldwork at a preeminent US lab that studies the human microbiome, and as well as at scientific field sites in Bangladesh, studying infant malnutrition. So the book examines how microbes travel between human guts in the field and in the microbiome laboratories. This is a very important book. Gut Anthro has been described as a tour de force of science tech studies and medical anthropology, and it's also very personal and deeply theoretical. Dr. Benezra is an assistant professor at the Stevens Institute of Technology in the School of Humanities.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be on this panel. As a social scientist, working within the sciences, transdisciplinary collaboration is really important to me, and so I'm really happy to be here. So thank you so much for this invitation. As Dr. Elton said, I am a sociocultural anthropologist, so I've been studying human microbiomes and the scientists who study microbiomes for the past decade. I worked collaboratively for several years with the Gordon Lab at Washington University School of Medicine, where scientists were studying whether differences in the human gut microbes affect predisposition to malnutrition in children. I also worked at the lab's field site in Dhaka, Bangladesh, where Bangladeshi mothers and children were enrolled in a microbiome and malnutrition study. There, I worked with scientists and researchers at the International Center for Diarrheal Disease Research, Bangladesh. It's locally known as ICDDRB. I followed microbes to homes in Dhaka where microbes were both conceptually non-existent and practically a matter of life and death. As lab members studied the relationships between gut microbes and malnutrition, I explored how an anthropologist could become a member of a scientific team and contribute ethnographic data while asking biological scientists to make space for social science expertise and thinking. Microbiomes show the interconnection between biological processes and social practices. How we live affects what microbes we have, and what microbes we have affect how we live. So a couple of questions you might have at this point. One, it might be, what do anthropologists do? Sociocultural anthropologists study the complex cultural lives of people, their decisions, social practices, and relationships. We use the method of ethnography to ask questions about people and the world. We do what we call field work, which is going out into the field and talking to people. And we use the method of ethnography to ask these questions. The ethno part is observing and talking to people who are going about their everyday lives. And the graphy part is when we take all of that information and analyze it and write about it. Our work is primarily qualitative. We don't produce clean, noise-free data. Our sample sizes are usually tiny. For instance, my work in Bangladesh, I talked to 9 families during my fieldwork. It's a very small N, right? As an anthropologist, what I love about the microbiome is that it brings together social intimacies with our biological selves in ways that show us how these two things are inextricably entangled. Microbial populations are affected by how and where we are born, what food we eat, who we live with, and who we love. And those microbes are digesting our food, training our immune systems, interacting with our states of health and illness, moods, and behaviors. So these are a couple of the Bangladeshi families that I studied and worked with, preparing food, their chilies being dried. So we know that metagenomic technologies are revealing the impact microbial communities have on human health. And in turn, social scientists are beginning to have microbial concerns as we start to learn about how poverty, race, lack of access to healthcare, and food all shape our microbial populations. So another question you may have is, how can anthropologists and human microbial ecologists work together? So sociocultural anthropologists don't like to make generalized conclusions about cultures, societies, or groups of people. But ethnography does provide insights into what life is actually like for people on the ground, giving important details that might not be visible in something like microbial genomics. It can shed light on the transnational and local realities of people embedded in global scientific research and health programs. It can show why health interventions sometimes don't work, why they aren't practical or implementable in real life. An example I like to always share is that when I was in Bangladesh, there was a huge public health campaign to boil water. The water in urban Dhaka is notoriously polluted. It's full of all kinds of agrochemicals, sewage, also arsenic and heavy metals. So all families are told to boil their water. But in my experience, when I was studying these families, not a single family boiled water. And they had heard the public health campaign, they knew about this message, but they didn't implement it in real life. And when I asked them why, it was because I found out that 5 families would share 2 gas burners, and they would have notoriously unreliable gas service. So it might go off at 9 a.m. for the rest of the day. So mothers in particular were making this decision to cook food for their families for the whole day, instead of, they were like, I can't take an hour to boil a huge pot of water. I have to cook food, right? So while we have these interventions, sometimes on the ground, people can't make them happen in real life. They're not practical to their actual lives. So these transdisciplinary collaborations are not easy. They're very, very, very difficult, right? Even if both parties in the partnership come to the table with open minds, willingness, and generosity. We all know that each of our own disciplines has a particular language, a specific way of conducting research, a special way that we write papers. We never really learn how to talk to the other kinds of researchers or how to work together. So during my collaboration, I realized that social and biological scientists may not even start with the same idea of health. So for my human microbial ecologists, the health that's important to study in the microbiome might consist of diet, geography, mode of birth, vaccinations, etc. As an anthropologist thinking about mothers and babies in Dhaka, all of those things might matter, along with important influences like gender, class and ethnicity, working in environmental conditions in garment factories, a violence of a colonial national history, a corrupt and non-existent governmental systems of sanitation and water. And when we start to pile all of these concepts of health on top of each other, the picture becomes very messy and confusing. But it also becomes more detailed, more complete, and eventually more precise. This is why microbiome science and anthropology need each other, to make the picture complicated, but also to get it right, to make it accurate. So all of my work asks, what if we consider the social and the biological together? As microbiome science endeavors to use computationally derived data to develop probiotics as treatments for, in this case, a malnourished microbiome, can collaborating social scientists make sure that these interventions don't circumvent the complex and confusing social conditions that people have to survive every day, right? Can we work together to make the most complete picture possible? And Dr. Gordon and I wrote this paper for PNAS to sort of think about how we can make an anthropology of microbes where we can collaborate across disciplines to address these problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Benezra. We are now going to start the roundtable. Thanks once more to our 3 speakers for your very insightful contributions. We are now going to have a little conversation. I wanted to start with Dr. Benezra and jump into those questions of transdisciplinarity. Your work, as you've described, is very different, and your critical qualitative health research lens is going to be very different from our colleagues here. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on what the scientific community that needs to gain from work like yours? Like, what do they need to get right in terms of working together, or not necessarily working together, but learning from the social sciences, learning from your critical qualitative lens?
It's a great question and not an easy one. So I teach at a STEM institution. So all my students are scientists and engineering students. And the training that those fields have is so different, right, than the social sciences and things like that. And again, we aren't trained to collaborate with each other. Collaboration is a great catchphrase, but there aren't jobs in collaborative. You have to get a faculty job in a department. You have to publish in a disciplinary journal. You have to get funding in a specific field. So those things, there aren't, collaborative grants that often. There aren't collaborative journals and things like that. And so my goal professionally and as a researcher is really to bring qualitative research to the microbiome science, because so many parts of our microbial populations are determined by our social intimacies just as much as they are by our biology. And so those things are just inextricable. We can't take them apart. So we have to study them equally, right? And so they're importantly together in a way that we can't, extract them. And as I said, the Gordon Lab was working on developing a probiotic for a malnourished microbiome. And that is their specialty, and that's what they should be doing. They may not be able to think about infrastructural problems in urban Bangladesh, but also you can't leave questions like that out of the equation, right? You can't leave them out of the science because they are affecting your scientific results. So my job is to sort of try to ask those questions and get those different ways of thinking into the microbiome science.
Thanks. And before I go to Dr. Finlay and Dr. Mubareka for your response or your engagement with this idea of transdisciplinarity, I do want to follow up with one more question for Dr. Benezra, which is, there is this growing interest in the microbiome in the social sciences. So where do you think that scholars like us should be looking to now?
I think on the other side, the social scientists also need to change and adjust, right? Instead of just having a critical purview on the science and always being like, science is doing this wrong, or this is, the problems of science, we need to really learn how to be more cooperative and work together and really lend our expertise. Instead of expecting scientists to be experts in the social sciences, which they aren't, being able to lend our expertise to really improving science, to make it the most ethical and effective it can be. So that would be my answer. I think that there has to be give on both sides. And I think we really need to come together to make it, better for everyone.
Dr. Finlay, Dr. Mubareka, would you like to comment on working with social scientists or thinking about social science?
Yeah, I'd love to comment on that. I co-run a CFAR group, Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, called Humans in the Microbiome. And about half of it is what you traditionally call microbiologists, and the other half is philosophers, anthropologists, developmental theorist type thing. And it's very fun because we know the science of the microbiome as scientists, that's what we deal with. But as being shown, there's all these other things we don't think about. And just to give you one example, we just finished writing a paper with a group of engineers. How do you design a microbiome-friendly building? So we hermetically seal these buildings, make them airtight, make sure there's no microbes. Yet we know we somehow have to let microbes in, let it breathe, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a fascinating experiment about how you can do these things. So I think we have the microbiome science, but we also have all these other things. And as Samira pointed out, microbes are intensely connected with the rest of this world. And One Health, more and more realizing that what happens in a human has been, what we ate, where we come from, what the world is type thing. And you cannot learn all these areas as a scholar. So we collaborate, and it takes a while. It often takes many drinks and evenings together to figure out what languages we're each talking. And yet I think that there's real excitement to be found there academically, and it really will help you solve the problem in general.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add 1 or 2 points. We've done a lot of multidisciplinary research, but we still keep falling in the same umbrella group of life sciences. And I think that that's part of the issue, is that I do think we're better now than we used to be perhaps 10 years ago at bringing different life scientists together. But now we really need to go beyond that and think about, humanities, social sciences, law. Just seeing what's happening right now, for example, the negotiations for the new pandemic instrument, or accord, initially was informed by content expertise, but the reality of the negotiations, it's all social sciences, humanities, and law and political science that will determine whether it's successful or not. So I think the other bridge in research, we can all start as researchers or continue as researchers to make those extra connections. But I think also in terms of science advice, making sure that that's also transdisciplinary so that it directly informs policy, ultimately.
Thank you. I'm going to direct my next question to Dr. Finlay and invite others to respond and engage as you wish. Given that our microbiome has likely changed significantly since the pre-industrial era, how do you anticipate ongoing shifts, such as those that are being driven right now by globalization, human migration, the food system? How do you think these are going to continue to affect human health? You're muted, Dr. Finlay.
Yes, thank you. Great question. I mean, I think the answer is definitely yes, it's going to affect us. If you think of how we evolved, go back, I don't know, 10,000 years, think of what humans were doing, and they were sleeping with their animals. They were, I tend to say the world was covered in a veneer of feces. There was a lot of manure and feces everywhere, kind of thing. And you were intimately in contact with that. And then what were we eating? Well, go back even further. We were hunter-gatherers, mainly nuts and fruits and things like this, immense amounts of fibers. And as farming came on and we started to clean up the world, we got less and less of these microbes. And I think a major worry now is we've evolved with all these microbes that we're not selecting for anymore, and they're disappearing. And we're worried we're going to get to the stage where, oh no, there's these missing microbes that 3 generations ago we had, but we don't have them anymore. We know they are important for whatever we need them for, and we know we need them for lots of things like digesting your food type thing. So I think it's a really interesting point, and some of us are starting to think, well, okay, we've really kind of damaged the microbiome. How can we repair it? How can we rewild it? How can we reconstitute it? I'm not saying going back to how we lived 10,000 years ago, but I think we've got to pay attention to these microbes because they're critical for us. And as we realize, as the antibiotics carpet bomb our microbes, we're doing significant damage to these things. So I think that that's a great question to think about. What are we doing to our microbes? How do you replace your own so you're healthier? And then also, how do we as a society replace them? Because living in a major city is a very different world than living, in the bush somewhere, for example. So I'll stop there.
So I'm gonna jump in with a question. You talked about diet, and I know that many people are often wanting to pose questions about diet when they hear about the microbiome, and we're talking about scales. So we're thinking about the scale planetary, social, and individual. So just in terms of how should people respond when you talked about Parkinson's and how a change in diet can prevent, how should people respond to this research now?
So the fastest way to change your microbiome is change your diet. Within 2-3 days, there's a big shift in the microbes. And this is and study after study after study is showing that basically going back to eating more fiber, more fruits, nuts, legumes type thing, away from highly processed foods, away from white sugars, white starches, away from red meat. So things like the Mediterranean diet, which I think most people know about, that is being shown for obesity, diabetes, asthma. There's one that's being tweaked. It's like the Mediterranean diet. It's called the DASH diet, or it incorporates a DASH diet called the MIND diet. That is pretty much Mediterranean diet. That shows like a 50% drop in Alzheimer's rates if you follow this diet. So my quick answer to diet is follow the Mediterranean or something diet. That does immense wonders for your health. But also remember that it's not for you, it's for your microbes that then affect you. It's not because you're getting more, nice nutrients out of these things. Actually, it's a driving the microbes. And the way it works is you eat fiber. That's broken down by these microbes that are way down in your gut. They make these things called short-chain fatty acids, which they're anti-inflammatory, so they decrease the inflammation, which is bad for you, and they basically are beneficial for health. They give nutrients to the cells, etc. So eat lots of fiber, follow the Mediterranean diet, and the studies are now so numerous that it's just overwhelming that a healthy diet means a healthy person.
I think this is a really important place, again, where social science can intervene, right? Because not everyone has access to that kind of diet, right? If you live in a food desert, you may have no access to nutritious food at all. And so this is where things like, resource, access, healthcare access, poverty, then affect what microbes you have or are able to even influence, right? Or change durably. So these social sort of structural issues come into play then in how you can alter your microbiome.
Just very briefly now with my infectious diseases position hat, thinking about the co-benefits of reducing antibiotic use, not just in humans, but you've brought up food and food security, and also the expansive use of antimicrobials in food animals. So there are a lot of co-benefits to be had, around focusing on that as well, especially by not only perhaps from the microbiome perspective, but ideally and ultimately reducing antimicrobial resistance too.
Dr. Mubareka, in your presentation, you talked about landscape immunity, and you suggested we might want to dig into that a little bit more. Would you like to take a moment to do that now? What should we be thinking about?
Yeah, and it's a fairly new concept, and I will openly admit, which is why I mentioned Dr. Plowright's name. I'm not an expert in this area, but it's a concept that I think is really critical, because we tend to spend a lot of time thinking about host immunity, particularly at the cellular level, but also the individual host level. But what we often forget is that pathogens live in an ecological niche. That niche might be, there's a cellular milieu, but that cell is in a host. That host is in a population, and it shares an ecosystem with other populations. And in a pristine ecosystem, so a pristine forest, for example, there's a balance. You have a diversity of hosts that ideally are healthy, so have, intact, robust, innate immunity. And because a lot of pathogens will be species specific, if there is a diversity of hosts in that particular forest, let's take that as an example, the pathogens will be dispersed. But as you start with human incursions and other land use effects that disrupt that, you're not only then potentially reducing the biodiversity, but you're also bringing the pathogens into proximity with new species that they normally would not have encountered. And perhaps the host immunity of those species might be compromised because of the stress, malnutrition. So it's a fairly large topic, but that kind of gives you a sense of how biodiversity on the global scale is really important in terms of forming a barrier to pathogen spillover. So just a quick example, if you, as humans, move into pristine forests, you tend to eliminate larger predators, though that allows some of the smaller mammals, for example, rodents, to proliferate. Rodents carry a lot of different things. And so now you've allowed a reservoir to proliferate, and B, you've brought a new host species closer to that reservoir. So that's just an example, and there are many others, but
Oh, Dr. Mubareka seems a bit frozen. Let's hope she returns. I'm going to move on to another question and hope that Dr. Mubareka gets some good internet connection again. I wanted to ask each of you, and how does your research challenge popular understandings of health? And by that I mean the idea that to be healthy, we need to eat well and we need to exercise, basically. So how does your research challenge that? And I believe Dr. Mubareka is rejoining, and I will pose that question to her when she comes back. But please, if either of you would like to start.
Go ahead, Amber.
Thanks. I mean, obviously, I'm working very strongly with social determinants of health, right? Other frameworks of health besides the biological. And so all of those things, community health, environmental health, health justice, all those things as being really important. And that's why the microbiome, to me, feels like such a natural partner with microbiome science. Microbiome science and social science together make a lot of sense to me because, there are some types of, lab science or bench science, and where you're working on one protein your entire career, and the, translational part of it doesn't make that much sense with social science. But microbiome science is so importantly determined by all of the things we do in our lives. And so I think microbiome science has the potential to really expand into a more holistic idea of health that I think, just like this panel is titled, is planetary, right? And like Dr. Mubareka is saying, like, is really from the smallest, on the micro level to the planetary one, and incorporating all of those social factors.
Yeah, maybe if I could jump in. I mean, the microbiome is I say is rewriting the whole medical textbook, basically, the whole medicine concepts. I mean, we used to think the lung was completely sterile. I remember teaching in undergraduate classes, the lung is sterile. It's not sterile. There's a lung microbiome, for example. And many of these things, many of the diseases that, we now know obesity and type 2 diabetes are really driven by the microbiome. If I said that 10 years ago, they say, no, that can't be true. Well, cardiovascular disease, we know the microbes play a major role in that. And just to give an example, another challenge is our work with asthma. So when kids used to get ear infections, the first thing a pediatrician do would they prescribe an antibiotic for otitis media, whether or not, and that may or may not work, but that was standard practice. So little kids get a lot of antibiotics early in life. In BC, we had a program where we tried to decrease the use of antibiotics. And over 10 years, there's a great big drop, about 25% decrease in antibiotic use. Well, asthma takes 5 years to happen. 5 years later, we predicted we would see a massive drop in asthma rates in BC. That's exactly what we saw. So by decreasing the antibiotic use by pediatricians in kids less than 1 year of age, we reduced asthma in BC by 25%. That's amazing. Asthma is like the number one reason why kids get admitted to the emergency room, et cetera. And so this challenged the whole dogma of why do we use antibiotics for otitis media when you don't need them. In Europe, they don't treat it, for example, with antibiotics. So there's tons of examples of how the microbiome is basically forcing people to rethink how these things work. I mean, I go to brain meetings all the time, and everyone wants to know about the microbiome now because the gut-brain connection. They realize microbes are affecting the brain. Who'd think that Alzheimer's or Parkinson's has a microbe component to it? So that's what I think makes this field so exciting, is it's really rewriting our way of thinking. And suddenly experts in these fields realize that they have to learn about microbes as well as whatever they're studying, kind of thing, which I think is really neat.
Thank you. Welcome back, Dr. Mubareka. We are just asking the question, how does your research challenge popular understandings of health? And I think it might build really nicely off what you were talking about in terms of landscape immunity. And popular understandings of health, meaning like this, the common idea, to be healthy, I need to exercise and eat well.
No, and I think it also draws attention to the concept of health and also wellness. So I think everyone was fully exhausted by the pandemic, trying to think more proactively about how to prevent and stay healthy and be well. And in terms of how that changes the sort of more common concept of health, I think I will draw again on the concept of One Health and the interconnections between the health of a number of different factors. So the ecosystem, obviously, we're very familiar with our domestic animals, and including livestock, but also companion animals. And there are a lot of interdependencies there that are very clear. What perhaps is a little bit less clear and may feel a little bit more distant and less direct, but I would argue is incredibly important, is also the health of wildlife for a number of different reasons. So I like to say that One Health is public health. If you ignore that, I mean, the story of influenza virus in dairy cattle, I'm an influenza virologist, and if you had asked me a year ago, you know, what would happen if it spilled over into dairy cattle, I would have probably laughed and said, oh, that, you know, chances of that are so remote. And we realize now that we have these major gaps in knowledge. We know very little about the interactions between different pathogens, non-pathogens, and hosts. And thanks to Brett and other people's work, we've really unveiled a lot of the mystery for humans, but who knows for other animals and what those interactions are. And I'm hoping that in the next 10, 20 years, we can move beyond, and I think we've started, what's descriptive and into more the dynamics and the function and the impact. We're seeing a little bit of that on the human side. Many of you might have heard the term personalized medicine. I think that that's, you know, partly evolved from, you know, all the good work that's been done on microbiomes, but, you know, we haven't really applied it in a way that is beneficial to other populations apart from ourselves.
I think that's just such an excellent point. Just even what does health mean and to different populations, right? There may not be a universal definition for that. One of the first questions I asked the Bangladeshi families was, what is nutritious food that you eat? And they had no concept of nutrition that was the same as mine. And I realized that that concept that I had a very Western idea, like you're saying, like vegetables, low fats, no sugars. Basically, they're like, if we have food, it's nutritious, right? They had a completely different framework for understanding what nutrition meant. And so I had to really rethink how to even ask that question. So when we're talking about health, who's defining it, to, you know, what research priorities, right? Whose health?
It strikes me that we have three audiences that this research needs to get to. We have the public, of course, and I'm sure you have seen on social media the popular version of microbiome research. We have public health that Dr. Mubareka has alluded to, and also doctors that Dr. Finlay alluded to in medical school training. So maybe we can talk about each of these. Like, how does the family doctor or the lung specialist, how do different medical doctors learn about this, who are already practicing, who have learned that the lung is sterile, and how does public health respond, and then how do we respond as a society to in thinking about justice and who has access to the conditions for a healthy microbiome?
I've just gone on a tirade that our university has now taken microbiology out of the medical curriculum because they don't need it anymore. And because it's done, right? You know, we got antibiotics. What more do we need? There's way more important things to study. And they've taken what used to be, I used to teach medical school for all this microbiology stuff. We don't need that anymore. And I really think that is a misstep in that sense. So I think, and ironically, I think the public is actually, well, they're way ahead of clinicians in the whole microbiome world. They come in with Dr. Google printouts, you know, and hey, I can get my microbiome tested and I can do this and that. And what do you think? And the poor clinicians say, well, we haven't even done clinical trials on that yet. We don't know that. And I think that's a problem because people are basically bashing the medical profession but it takes a while to get anything approved in medicine. You've got to go through the standard trials and things. And so there's some very exciting things happening. You know, I was just on a call just now with a company that's putting 43 different microbes into people to get rid of vancomycin resistant organisms and beta-lactam spectrum resistance organisms as a drug. Mixture of 43 microbes, imagine that. So it is changing, but I think, you know, it all boils down to education. And I think as people realize that the microbiome is important, it's now getting put back into things. I think public health is finally starting to get it. If you have, for example, an obese friend, you have an over 50% higher chance of being obese yourself. Potentially that's through microbes, for example. I had a piece published in Science saying, are non-communicable diseases communicable? And we know, for example, the rates of some of these diseases in the spouse are way higher than they should be genetically type thing. So I think it's realizing these microbes important, learning about it, and then actually how to then apply the systems that we all know and love to those things.
I'm just going to jump in here and invite the audience to put any of your questions in the Q&A box. We'll get to those next. Dr. Benezra, Dr. Mubareka.
I mean, I can start briefly. I think sometimes we don't draw enough attention to the fact that much of what we do can be related to the microbiome, at least as physicians. And I think, so just as an example, some of you may have heard about phage therapy. We have a lot of antimicrobial resistance. And so and it's not really a new solution. People have, worked on this for several decades, but it's now coming more to the forefront. And I think there are potentially more data and guidelines around this. But the idea of phage therapy is, Artem, I think it was you who mentioned that there are viruses and bacteria that will infect, parasites, for example, that are then infecting you. So phages are viruses that infect bacteria. So not only do we have bacteria in our gut, but we have viruses that are infecting those bacteria. And sometimes you can use that knowledge to use phages to destroy resistant bacteria. And I think people are very intrigued by this prospect. We're desperate for new approaches, but they don't make the link that much of this work is based on all the groundwork around microbiomes and viromes that have existed before. So I think that's one thing. And I think also just training the workforce from the ground up. It's and I say this as potentially mid to late career physician, teaching people who have practiced in a certain manner to do things or think of things differently can be challenging. These are not mutually exclusive approaches, but starting, and I think to what you were saying, Brett, now is the time to be talking about microbiology, not only during medical school, but undergraduate and even before that. So training a workforce that it has a comfort and an in-depth knowledge of what the possibilities are, I think will be really key.
I think that in general, microbiome science is still sort of at a luxury level in terms of the public and knowledge about it, that there's a certain, class, race, segment of the population that knows what the microbiome is concerned about things like, vaginal seeding during C-sections and things like that. People who don't have prenatal care at all aren't worrying about their microbiome, right? They don't even know what it is. And so there's quite a disconnect, I think, between what segments of the population know about the microbiome and how it affects our health, and those that have no idea or maybe just need basic care. And I think where the public is coming in contact with it most is sort of commercialization of things like probiotics, right? Which are coming out of a lot of research labs, things like probiotics for like breastfeeding, support, or, where it gets to be a little tricky, where people are, the sort of that whole, that campaign is that, they're essential microbes missing from perhaps your breast milk or from formula that you need to supplement with a probiotic, which is super expensive to maintain and to take continuously, right? And I think, the efficacy of probiotics is not, there's so much more work to do to find out, how well and how durable those changes are in microbiome. So I'm not sure what needs to happen and to sort of make that parity for the public in terms of who even has knowledge about what the microbiome is. But I think there is there's quite a disconnect right now.
Each one of you have mentioned the difficulty of understanding the complex interactions between microbes, but also society. And how will science have to adapt to answer these questions and also consider like this question of access to microbes as a determinant of health, and in terms of an equal justice access, like everybody having access to this. What does science have to do to change to make that a priority so we don't just end up with more personalized medicine? I know it's a tough question.
Well, I'll wear the scientist hat. And I mean, first of all, we have to have good solutions based on good science before we can, just before we can start thinking about implementing them. And the microbiome has been heavily influenced by a lot of hype and a lot of excitement. And there's been, in some cases, I think a lot of serious data. We're talking about probiotics. I will talk about probiotics for a second now. If you want to know what probiotic used or whatever, there's a wonderful site called probioticchart.ca, or just Google search probiotics charts. This tells you what all the probiotics are and what is the clinical evidence they can be used for whatever disease and which ones actually work. And there are a few that actually have worked in clinical trials, and those are up there, but many are not, and for a whole bunch of reasons we don't get into. So I think if science is coming up with solutions, but as we know that just because you have a scientific solution, that does not mean it then gets embraced by society. And, it may be a very expensive drug. And so obviously not everyone can get to it. And that's where policy comes into a major effect, health policies and things, the major roles there. And I think this is not a problem unique to the microbiome in the underdeveloped and developing places in the world where just resources are so limited. We have solutions, but how do you then use them? And often solutions that are made in our society don't work in that society for any number of reasons. It's a very difficult problem. So I'll let someone who knows something talk about, like Amber, for example.
Do either of you want to jump in, or I can? Okay, I'm going to move. Oh, Samira, please.
I was just going to briefly make 2 points. I think it underscores how important the work that Amber is doing. I think that we do tend to be very focused on Western populations because we do tend to do research where we're located, where the funding bodies are located, but it really doesn't support the global dissemination of results for something that is potentially this varied, really, across. You really can't globally apply everything that you find here on many levels, but I would imagine especially for the microbiome. I think the other thing science needs to do is, it comes back to some of the discussion we had at the top around transdisciplinary work, because we're okay at collecting things and sequencing and reporting sequences, and we're trying to get better at what they mean. So we're trying to turn data into intelligence, but then how do you take that intelligence and turn it into knowledge? And I think that that's the bridge we need to cross to get the public. I feel like data and intelligence, you get public health and a lot of the medical field, but to turn it into substantial, meaningful knowledge is where we really need to go to benefit all of society. But please, I hope there's no follow-up question as to exactly how to do that, because I'm not sure.
We have an excellent question from the audience that we'll start with, and this leads very nicely out of what we've been talking about just now. So our audience member writes, there's been mention of society's interactions. Can we as a society possibly implement policies that would protect the microbiome within people and the environment? So thinking what policies might, at different levels of government, might be enacted to protect or steward microbiome and environment?
There's a really good example that's been done where for a long time they used antibiotics as growth supplements in agriculture. And when you use these antibiotics, these animals would grow 20% or so better. Worked great. You went through a lot of antibiotics, you used tons of antibiotics, but then they started to realize, of course, this then caused antimicrobial resistance, etc. And they realized it's a problem. So Europe a long time ago, and Canada and the US just in the last few years have now banned this antibiotics as growth supplements, which is a really, it took forever, and trying to convince farmers not to put antibiotics in their feedlots was a huge issue. But we now know it was doing more harm than good in the grand scheme of things, and that was a very good example of society actually getting together and saying, no, you cannot use antibiotics for growth supplements, and you can't anymore. So I think that's one example of a success story that was actually done.
There's also a campaign called Choosing Wisely. So it is aimed a bit at the public as well, to really discourage people from expecting antibiotics with every visit, for example, and normalizing the idea that, you know, they're not always necessary. So that might be another example from civil society perspective, is, you know, taking some of that advice and guidance and rethinking, do I really, I know it might make me feel better temporarily, but it could potentially impact microbiome down the road. And especially in areas where water sanitation might be an issue as well. So you might see, you know, antimicrobial resistance spread in very different ways than how you might see it spread in other jurisdictions. So again, tailoring the research to a particular place so that you can apply lessons learned and policy and recommendations to the public for that place. And I think perhaps Amber can speak to this, but that's where participatory research comes in, because if you just don't even know where to start if you don't start with a community perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe this becomes a science communication or education issue, right? Because public health did a great job of making everyone afraid of microbes, right? Of like teaching us that they're pathogens, that they're disease causing, that there's an invisible world that can make you sick. And that was a lot of work. But now we have to sort of, you know, have a different message about how, like, microbiome stewardship, how important they are to us, our health, and the planet, and how there's a whole lot of them that aren't disease causing, right? That are doing different things that are sort of crucial to us. And I think that last point, that really asking communities what their health priorities are, and figuring out how to do microbiome science in that model, instead of saying, this is the science we want to do, let's do it on this population, is a different way of going about it that might be more effective, and that would really help that problem. But yeah, I don't, you know, microbiome needs a good PR person in terms of teaching people how very important they are to us and our health.
If I can again interject, I think there's been I think one of the coolest experiments that humanity's ever done, and that was COVID. It was, you know, done on a global scale, and had so many remarkable things, but not necessarily good. But you know, leading up to it, we'd been inching towards, okay, we have good microbes. Maybe we should expose our kids to good microbes. I wrote a book called "Let Them Eat Dirt." I raise your kids with your microbes, kind of thing. And then COVID hit, and this mortal fear of, like, I can't even talk to my neighbors, et cetera. We were locked up for a couple of years, kind of thing. And we know this had profound effects on the microbiome, especially in the elderly. But there's this tension between hygiene, which keeps away the bad ones, and then, you know, the exposure to good ones type thing. And really, we have to balance that as a society. I mean, if there's no risk of an infectious disease, don't, you know, embrace your microbes. If there is a risk, we have to think about it. So I think that's a really good example of tension in society, where we, you know, we basically reverted back to what we'd used in the 1800s for contagion control, complete lockdown, complete isolation kind of thing, because we didn't have any other aspects to it. But that did amazing things to our microbiome too.
An audience member has posted a question that speaks to the policy issue also. They write, would it not be a great link between microbiome research and public health to invest in serving a healthy Mediterranean diet in schools and follow the microbiome of these kids? So that's a question to you. Can a policy intervention happen through diet, for example, like such as the recently funded National School Food Program?
Absolutely. I mean, they just changed the Canadian Food Guide a couple of years ago, getting a little more healthy. Yes, I mean, I think that's, and the question is, you know, if you've had the science backing it up, yes, we know the Mediterranean diet is much healthier for everyone, really, and that science is there. So that's, you need to convince public health that, you know, that this is important and we should do this. I totally agree with that. It would be amazing benefit. I mean, in terms of healthy living, there's 5 components, and they all deal with the microbiome. There's a healthy diet. That means lots of fiber, less, you know, white sugars, white flour type thing. There's exercise. We all know this. There's decreased stress. We live in a very stressful environment, and there's a community. You should be living with other people. Ideally, you've got your 80-year-old daughter taking care of a 100-year-old father and 5 other generations, and dogs and pets and everything living all in this multi-generational house. That's how we evolved as humans. There's good microbial exposure there. And the 5th one we've only added recently is sleep. And all 5 of these reasons, they're all good for you, but they're through a microbial lens. Microbes have big influences in all 5 of these areas. And so even when you're thinking about healthy aging and stuff, if you think of it through a microbial lens, it impacts all these areas. So yeah, I would love to see, but you know, we already know diet and exercise is good for us. Do we do that? You know, it's not new. We now know it's new through the microbiome, but how we've been trying to convince people to eat healthy for a long time. So yeah.
Dr. Mubareka, is there a One Health policy that might support microbes, microbiome, healthy microbiomes at different scales?
Well, people are just starting to develop intergovernmental tools around One Health, and there's now a One Health joint plan of action that's been developed. And what's heartening is that it's been developed through what we call the quadripartite. So that's the World Health Organization, the World Organization of Animal Health, FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization, and UNEP, the UN Environment Program. And hopefully, it'd be nice if at some point the agency that's involved in plant and plant health could join. But I have to say, I think it's early days. There's no single policy that I'm aware of, but I think that if we do take a One Health approach to this, and there is one action track that is focused on food security, I think that that's potentially where this could come in. The challenge is always access. You know, it could be recommended, but what's the likelihood, even within Canada, that, you know, there's good access to a Mediterranean diet? I was only there for one summer, and it was just Goose Bay. It wasn't even the far north. And I remember, you know, picking up a box of tea that was, I won't tell you which decade this was, but it was a very long time ago. It was, you know, almost $20, and an orange that was, I can't remember, around $10 or something. So again, I think we can make recommendations, but we also have to think about the context that we're making them in to see how feasible and realistic it is. And I think that's something that One Health will strive to do, but I don't know that we're there yet.
Thank you. We'll go to another audience question. What is the effectiveness of probiotic products in enriching our microbiome? Given the vast diversity of our gut microbiome, it will very likely be impossible to ever hope to restore a full microbiome in people. But can specific sets of probiotic fauna be used to help address various issues, including IBD, etc., writes the audience member.
I'll start. Probiotics, they're huge, right? Probiotics are not regulated by Health Canada or the FDA, so they basically are not as rigorously regulated as, say, any drug approval. So there's a lot of probiotics out there that are just, you know, some bug that so the claims you make don't necessarily have to be backed up by the clinical trials. And it's, you know, you think about, say, a lactobacillus, which is actually a vaginal microbe, you use it orally. Well, it's going down, so the vagina is acidic and there's lots of oxygen. The gut is anaerobic, no oxygen, and it's very basic. Problem is when you take probiotics, you have to take 10 billion a day because they don't stick. They basically pass through you. this is a great business model because you have to take them daily. But what we need and where probiotics is going is you need probiotics 2.0 or next gen probiotics, whatever you want to call it. And this is where I think there's a lot of excitement because they're from the gut for the gut. You're basically restoring a community. So they're mixtures of microbes. We call these things live biotherapeutic products. There's one, for example, for C. diff that's a mixture of 8 different microbes. You take it, it gets rid of C. diff, it works. Recurrent C. diff, for example. So it's a bit of a hairy area right now in terms of probiotics, but it is moving towards biochemically based. Look, we need to supplement this community with these microbes that do this biochemically. They produce short chain fatty acids, which produce anti-inflammatories, which decrease inflammation in IBD, for example. And so they're moving towards this, and this is where it's going. So probiotics are coming. But up until now, it's been quite a mess. There was a paper published in Cell just a couple of years ago now saying that after you take antibiotics, well, you should take probiotics to recolonize yourself, right? Well, they showed that actually inhibited the colonization of normal microbes and actually probably wasn't a good idea in that case. So stay tuned with probiotics. They're coming. They're in phase 2 clinical trials and phase 3 clinical trials right now about good mixtures of microbes. And this will be going through the FDA and Health Canada as a drug, even though it's a mixture of a bunch of different microbes. This will be a drug that a clinician would prescribe for a particular disease. The other thing about probiotics is the rule is they can't hurt you. So if you like taking probiotics, they may not work, but go ahead, take them because they're not going to be harmful to you. So that's my $10 on probiotics. Samira, I'm sure you got lots to say.
I was going to defer back to you, Brett, because as a virologist, I have to admit we haven't been necessarily working on the bacterial microbiome per se, but certainly from a clinician's perspective, it must be one of the most common questions I was asked when prescribing antibiotics is, should I take probiotics? Which one should I take? How should I take them? And really, I think the dearth of data made it very challenging to answer those questions. And I think, having access to a healthy diet was certainly something that was pretty easy to recommend, again, fairly harmless. But it was difficult because of the marketing to these patients for probiotics, like the over-the-counter ones that were not regulated. And how do you counter that? Because again, I feel like patients want to do something. It gives a sense of, control and also risk mitigation for the antibiotics that they're taking, because C. difficile, especially for patients who have had it, is always something that people are highly concerned about. So they want to do anything they can to prevent it. But I look forward to probiotics 2.0.
Go to probioticcharts.ca. Seriously, I mean, probiotics do work for antibiotic-associated diarrhea. There's early infants, necrotitis enterocolitis, and things like that. There's actually yeast that seems to work for C. diff in clinical trials. So there's a couple that work. So I don't mean to dish all probiotics, but careful. It's like if you want a new pair of runners, you walk into a sporting goods store and there's walls full of joggers and basketball shoes and tennis shoes, and you just take the cheapest pair. That's what happens when you go to a health food store. And so you've got to do your research. There are some for some things. But it's still early days.
Thank you very much to all our panelists. I'm now going to hand it over to Dr. Abiola Olaitan to close us off.
And thank you so much to all the members of the panelists for all your great contributions. So thank you everyone that has joined us on this webinar today. We hope that the discussion on the microbiome in relation to our environment will inspire new ways of thinking about this important topic. And from Dr. Finlay's contribution which has really shed light on the impact of microbiome on diverse health issues, and also mentioning a very important concept of the missing microbes. So what do we do about missing microbes? I think that will also help us to start thinking about around all this. And from Dr. Mubareka's contribution, I think we can really begin to understand the connection between viruses, viral infections, and also how all this interact with our microbiome in general, and especially considering the recent COVID-19 pandemic. And also from Dr. Benezra's contribution, so she has really shed light on this aspect that is often overlooked, which is the social aspect of microbiome, and also how these social practices could impact our microbiome, and what are the, and even the difficulty in establishing some of these policies. I think those are great contributions. So once again, thank you. We appreciate all our panelists for their insight. And lastly, we want to say a very big thank you to the Gairdner Foundation and also the TELUS Health for facilitating this webinar. Thank you so much. And lastly, we thank everyone for joining today, and we look forward to future discussion and on this ever-evolving subject. And for now, I want to say thank you again and have a good rest of your day.